Welcome and thank you for joining me. This is Greg Soden. As a person who grew up far from a border in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, borders fascinated me as soon as I learned I wanted to travel. Having lived now in Missouri, Hawaii, Mexico, England, Canada, and now along the Canadian and USA border in Buffalo, New York, borders and border crossing has been a pretty consistent part of my life for many years at this point. But what about borders I haven't ever crossed or really even considered? When the book On the Edge, Life Along the Russia-China Border arrived from Harvard Press, I was immediately stunned to realize I had never once asked myself what life was like on that particular border of two global superpowers. I knew nothing. This book, co-authored by Dr. Franck Billé and Dr. Caroline Humphrey, is a fantastic glimpse into the ordinary and the specific relationships of the people and towns along this 2,600-mile international border. This conversation with Dr. Franck Billé was a real thrill, and we talk about the ordinary lives of citizens, crossing the border, and details of cities on both sides, but we also get into the broader relationships between these two countries, and we touch on the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and what that means for international relationships in general. I had a real blast, and I learned a lot, so please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Franck Billé. Dr. Franck Billé, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It is a delight to have you here, and I'm wondering if you can spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience, however you see fit.
Sure. So I'm trained. I trained in social anthropology at Cambridge, and then later on, after my PhD, I got more and more interested in geography. So I would see myself now as an anthropologist / geographer. Given my interest in space and borders, I think it's more of it was a kind of a natural transition for me to move from one to the other and somewhere in between.
Wonderful.
I'm currently the program director for the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies at UC Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And that's also something that is close to my interest in borders and regions that lie uncomfortably across borders. I think that would probably be my core focus, is how to talk about places that are not really easily subsumed within one nation state, but that go across, and spaces that tend to be difficult to map. I recently edited a collection on the idea of the state as a volume, a three-dimensional volume. And that's really kind of also similar to this. I mean, it really gives you the sense of this space that is difficult to map on 2D. So the idea of the state encompassing not only the land, but also the air, the subterranean, and all this materiality. I am currently finishing another book, also on borders, looking specifically at the connection between political states and bodies, and looking at bodily metaphors such as territorial phantom pains and territorial prosthetics. This book really tries to grasp with the attachment that citizens of most nations have to edges and corners, and try to understand why nations might be going to war for tiny specks of territory that are sometimes not even inhabitable. So I guess that's how I would kind of summarize my research generally. So really looking at borders and those spaces in between or beyond.
Well, speaking of borders, I mean, the world events that we are currently witnessing with Russia and Ukraine have to be, front and center on everybody's mind. And if people are listening to this interview years down the line, they will certainly remember what is going on in March and February and March of 2022 right now. But We'll get to that, I'm sure. Do you have a timeline for when that new book that you are finishing up might be coming into the world?
So I'm hoping to finish the manuscript around May. Then it will go for review. So it's probably going to be, if everything goes well, it'll be 2023.
Okay, cool. Great.
But I have published on the topic, so there's a couple of articles that are then becoming kind of sections of chapters.
Wonderful. Well,
yeah.
You do have a very new co-authored book with Dr. Caroline Humphrey, which is called On the Edge: Life Along the Russia-China Border from Harvard Press. And, for me personally, thinking about borders is really fascinating. I've been reflecting on my own life as I've been reading your book, because I've lived in the US, Mexico, England, Canada, and now I actually live on an international border between Buffalo, New York, and Fort Erie, Ontario. So borders have always personally fascinated me. And, what is on one side that is not on the other? What does one group have that the other doesn't have that live 5 minutes away? So these are questions that swirl in my mind frequently. And I'm just curious about the origin of your fascination of borders and borderlands. Where does this interest come from for you?
I think, like you, I've always found borders really fascinating. How these lines have been drawn very often artificially have come to have a life of their own. How two individuals living just a few miles away from each other would grow up with very different life experiences. They would be socialized differently in terms of language, popular culture, geopolitical attachment, etc. So I didn't grow up in a border region, but I always had this fascination for what was beyond the border. My parents were traveled quite a lot within the country, but they were not people who traveled much beyond. So I had this desire for as a child to go beyond the border and see what was on the other side. And it's only in my late teens that I ended up, going abroad. So I was born and raised in France.
Excellent.
And I've always been fascinated by how borders shape imaginaries, and we saw this very clearly at the beginning of the pandemic, when Italy shut down. Its neighbors did not even immediately close their borders, as if the countries beyond the international borderline somehow constituted a different world and sort of insulated them. And it's only when their own numbers started to climb that they enacted lockdowns. And this is something that we saw replicated pretty much globally. In the United States, it was kind of similar. It was, this state has very high numbers, therefore do not go there. But the state next to it might feel very differently about it and say, but here we're fine. So it's really interesting how these lines are not just, abstract. For people, they have some kind of visceral, kind of embodied presence, and I think that's really something I found particularly fascinating.
Excellent. I'm wondering, in relation to the book, it's a very specific border, the Russia-China border, and I'm wondering how you came to be interested in Russia and China specifically. Where does your origin of interest with these two particular places stem from?
So I would agree that it's a very interesting border because it's very unusual in the sense that it separates two very large countries. And there are two countries that are global center of power and see themselves as civilizations in their own right. So Caroline and I were intrigued by the interface between them. We hear a lot about policies and agreements between Russia and China, pronouncements, between Moscow and Beijing, but hardly anything about the borderland itself and the line of interface and the people who live in it, or on it, or around it. So we were curious about this. So how does it feel to be there, right there on the border between these two giant nations? And me personally, I was especially curious about the two towns of Hehe in the China side and Blagoveshchensk on the Russian side, because they're the only two sizable towns that you could compare in terms of footprint that are right opposite each other. They're just separated by a river. And I wanted to see what it was like for these two towns and how they would imagine themselves, how they would present themselves to the other side, and how they might have things in common or how they might be different. So that's where I decided to carry out the bulk of the research. Caroline looked at other parts of the border.
Excellent. Well, tell me a little bit about your work with Dr. Caroline Humphrey. How did you come to co-author this book together? And tell me about this working relationship that the two of you have.
Right. So Caroline was my PhD advisor at Cambridge. At the time, I was working on a dissertation, which was then published as a book, focusing on the anti-Chinese sentiments in Mongolia. So while borders did not feature explicitly in the research, the notion that really undergirds and sustains Mongolian forms of Sinophobia, they're very much expressed in geopolitical terms and orientation. So I guess it was kind of natural progression for me to just look at the border specifically after that. And my conversation with Caroline naturally gravitated towards borders in the context of East Asia. When an opportunity arose to apply for a grant to study one of the most strategic borders in the world, we thought of focusing on China and Russia. And the collaboration between the two of us felt like a natural evolution because we had so many conversations already. I moved to the States in 2015. So we ended up co-authoring the book at a distance, but we had years of collaboration and conversations as a solid basis. So it was actually kind of easy, and we knew each other's research and the writing process. So it was easy to divide the work and to have conversations over Zoom and do the book together. It was a challenge. I was afraid at first that the book might feel disjointed, but I think we pulled it off.
I think you did too. It's wonderful. And, I was thinking about this book and this topic in general. And I'm a person who considers myself a relatively curious person. I like learning about things in the world. But when this book landed in my lap, I thought to myself, wow, I have never once in my life considered what life is like along this particular border with these two massive world powers. And I realized that many people probably have that oversight. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you talk about this
Absolutely.
And people are like, wow, I've never thought about this before?
Absolutely. And I think the way we talk about certain states, the way we talk about Russia and as a European state and China as an Asian state, some people might not even realize how much of a border they have in common. Because they're seen and studied in very different ways. I mean, if you want to study Russia, there's not a lot of scope for you to then include China in your research and vice versa. So very, very few people actually focusing on the relation between the two. Most people focusing on Russia will focus on Western Russia, and most people focusing on China will focus on the mainland, like the either the south or the core, and not the edges. So that's another thing. It's like Caroline and I are co-editing a book series at Amsterdam University Press, where we try to encourage people to pitch us books that are really about these edges. So not just Russia, China, but also Japan, Korea, all these interactions between these countries that tend to be studied separately or within separate realms, Asian studies or Eastern European studies. So yes, so that's I totally agree that it's something that most people would not think of. Yeah,
that sounds like an amazing series as well, with endless potential for years and years of research to come to light.
Yeah, I hope so.
Oh, wow. Okay, so let's talk about some basics a little bit about this border. A lot of my audience and people that listen to this show are teachers and students and college students. So let's talk about a little bit of some basics for fun.
Right.
How long is this border between Russia and China in kilometers and miles?
Okay, so it's 2,600 miles, which is around 4,000 kilometers. So it's quite sizable, but you also have to bear in mind that it used to be longer because Kazakhstan used to be part of the Soviet Union. So if you think about quite a large portion of their history, it was the border between the Soviet Union and China. So they included Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. So it was maybe twice as long. I think it might have been the longest border then, longest international border. Yeah.
So pre-1991, this was the longest border in the world?
Yeah, I If it was not the longest, one of the longest, yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm curious this is a really long border, but I'm wondering if there's like a variation of climate or anything like that. Like what is the climate like along this stretch of border?
So for most of it, it's a continental climate, which means that it's very cold in winter and can be quite hot also in summer. So there's a large variation between seasons. Um, and so the ocean is far away for a large portion of the border. Closer to the ocean is somewhat less harsh. So Vladivostok is not quite on the border, but it's in the border region. And it's an ice-free harbor, but it's still pretty cold in winter. There's always this people in Vladivostok, they call it the San Francisco of Russia, and there are similarities because there's fog and it's very hilly, but it freezes, in winter, so it's actually much more dangerous than San Francisco.
Gosh.
It's not as mild, yeah.
Excellent.
But, yeah.
I'm curious about some of the cities as well, because you've mentioned a couple of them, but what are some of like the major cities on either side that are border towns connecting China and Russia?
So on the Russian side, you would have Vladivostok at the very eastern end. Then you'll have Khabarovsk and Blagoveshchensk. So that the three sizable cities of about 500,000 overall. There's variations between all of them, but overall about 500,000 people. On the Chinese side, you have Manjuli, which is on the Mongolia-Russia-China border. You have Heihe, which is opposite Blagoveshchensk, and Suifenhe, which is not opposite Vladivostok, but it's kind of around that end, close to the on the eastern part.
A lot of your writing takes place in Heihe, right?
In Heihe and Blagoveshchensk, yes, the Chinese and Russian cities.
Tell me I'm curious what you were doing when you were visiting these two places. Like, how did you navigate this for you personally?
So as an outsider who's neither Chinese or Russian, I needed a visa, so either single entry or double entry. It was not easy to go back and forth. So what I did was I would fly to Beijing, take a train or a plane to Heihe, and spend some time doing research in Heihe. Then go across with a single entry visa in Russia and spend some time in Blagoveshchensk, and then return to China because I had a double entry visa for China and spend more time in Heihe and then return home. So that was kind of the classic way I would do that.
Excellent. One of my favorite things about your book is you talk about the accessibility across the rivers and across the borders. And I'm just so fascinated by your stories of phantom bridges and failed projects. And I'm wondering if you can just talk to me about like the accessibility for Russians and Chinese on both sides of the border for these cities.
Right. So the border was closed between the 60s to the end of the 80s because of disagreements, let's say political disagreements between the two countries. So it came close to war actually in the late 60s. So the border reopened in 1989, first gradually and then fully. And when the border opened, it was a great opportunity for both sides to trade. At the time, Russia was in a difficult situation economically, so there was possibility to go across the border and purchase goods in China. So there was a lot of we started to see a lot of movement. There was also a lot of mutual interest between the two sides. It was always easier for Russians to cross into China than the reverse, because partly because of demographic imbalance and because of historical reasons whereby Russians have been very anxious about Chinese presence. They're very worried about their their grasp on this vast region with very, very few people. They're afraid that Chinese might be able to, move in and overpower them. I mean, demographically. So the Chinese side grew much faster. At that time, between Hehe and Blagoveshchensk was already an established city, but there was hardly anything on the other side. Hehe was just a cluster of a few houses, was barely a village.
Yeah.
And we have pictures in the book that show the difference between the 1990 and now. And the Hehe has transformed into a sizable town.
Yeah, the pictures are amazing.
Yes, and actually, the Hehe is more built up. There's more skyscrapers. There's a lot more light. So it's fully transformed because there was this opportunity to trade with Russia. So people moved in from other parts of China, moved in and did business with Russia. So it's so the dynamic changed at that time during this since 1990, and we were very surprised to see that there were, at the time when we did the research, there was no bridges between Russia and China, no passenger bridges. So if for someone living in Blagoveshchensk, you see Hehe right on the other side, just 500 meters away. And to cross, you need to take a boat. You need to take a little ferry. There's no bridges. You cannot just cross. In winter, the river is frozen, so you cross by bus. But again, it's a specific bus. There are actually two services, one for Russians, one for Chinese. They both sides have a monopoly. And that it's really structured. This is very difficult. You cannot just go across like you might do in other parts of the world. So these phantom bridges we talk about is like this for the very, since the time the border reopened, there was these talks about borders, about bridges, and let's create a bridge. And the Chinese were willing to do that because they would be able to trade more. There'd be more exchange of people. It would be easier to go across. But the Russians have been very, very wary about the idea of a bridge that would just bring Chinese population maybe more easily into the country. So there's been a lot of projects that never started or that were delayed. You have bridges that are built on the Chinese sides all the way to the middle of the river and then nothing after. So it's been really fascinating for us because we really see what was the focus, the priority that each country was placing. So for China, it was really placing the focus on exchange, on making money, on developing. On the Russian side, it was about security. Even if you make less money, the city is not building as fast. The priority is security.
Gotcha. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's in the book itself. So in the book's introduction, I was captivated by the writing about the quote unquote civilizational differences. And, these places that you write about, they're right next to each other. They can see each other across these rivers. And like where I live, I picture myself here in Buffalo, New York. Whenever I'm on the bike path in downtown Buffalo, I can see Fort Erie, Ontario. It's right there across the Niagara River. So like the places that you write about are right next to each other, but you write about civilizational differences. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what this looks like in practice on the street. What are some of these major civilizational differences that differentiate these two places?
Right. So you're right. They're just across from each other, and from certain angles, when you're in Hehe or Blagoveshchensk, you do not see the river, and it feels like it's a continuous city. You have also tourists coming from elsewhere in Russia going to Blagoveshchensk, looking at Hehe, and sometimes getting confused and thinking that's the city center because it's much more, it's brighter, and and it's so close. So they feel it's the same city, and yet. Yes, people are completely different. And this is another reason why we found this border to be fascinating, because in most of the world's borders, the border will cut across the cultural continuum. And even in heavily surveilled borders, if you think about the US Mexico, I mean, in your border, US Canada is much more, there's much more cultural continuity on both sides.
Right.
But if you think about Russia, if you think about the US Mexico, that are quite different, two different environments, heavily surveilled, still one finds a lot of historical, cultural, and familial ties across the border.
I mean, El Paso and Tijuana springs to mind.
Yes, but even further, I mean, even if you think about California generally, I mean, there's this history of Mexican presence. There's a lot of Mexicans living here. There's a particular flavor to it, and that's what you see in most of the world. But it's not the case here. It's not the case in the Russia-China border, partly because the region, the border region, was populated after the creation of the border. So there are some indigenous populations throughout the region, but it's like a substratum, and on top of that, you have the Russians and the Chinese, who are much more numerous and who come from elsewhere. A lot of Russians actually come from Ukraine because of population movements where they were relocated because the country needed to be populated there, and they were brought from elsewhere. So a lot of people in Blagoveshchensk will have a Russian that is somehow speaking Russian with a Ukrainian flavor. A lot of them will have a Ukrainian ties to Ukraine. So they come from elsewhere. So then you have really two very discontinuous populations living just next to each other. And if I were to put you in Blagoveshchensk and you didn't know where you were, you would assume you're somewhere in Eastern Europe. You would not think you're on the border of China. Kheikha has a bit of a more Russian flavor because there's been more Russians coming, and they're trying to market there. So there's more signs written in Russian. So you feel that it's not, a typical Chinese city, but still, in any other ways, it's populated by Chinese. You eat the same food, and even the Russian elements that are in Kheikha, they tend to be a little bit, Disney-esque. They have this. They're more an imaginary of Russia rather than Russian very often.
Right.
And what we explain in the book is that the Kheikha is not just marketing itself to the Russian on the other side, and at least no longer. Now it's marketing itself to tourists in China who want to get a sense of what it's like to live on the border, or get a sense of what it's like to be, in Russia or Russia adjacent without having to cross the border and getting a visa and all that. So it's a bit of there's a slight theme parky quality to it. But generally, Kheikha is in any other ways, Kheikha is a very Chinese city. So in terms of civilization, I mean, that's the way people would talk about it. They would see themselves as very different. They in Blagoveshchensk, you would not have people say they would not see the city as hybrid. They see, no, it's a very Russian town. And so when you're on the Russian side, you'll hear, Russian music, you'll hear Western music. You're not going to hear Chinese music. There's not a lot of signs about, like Chinese script. There's not, if you go to the cinema, when I was there, I never saw a Chinese movie. So it's the orientation is very Western. I mean, it's similar to other parts of Russia. On the Chinese side, you would sometimes hear Russian music, again, because that's a way to sort of a sign of goodwill and sign of, we're neighbors and we're playing some of your music, but generally it would be Chinese music or Western as well. So, and in terms of food, same, so all these kind of a sensorial element is also very different on either side.
I mean, that is
crossing the border. You cross the border, and within, like after 500 meters, you're in a different world. It's fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, that is really amazing. And earlier I said El Paso, Tijuana when I meant El Paso, Juarez. So I screwed up back there. But it's just really interesting to think about how stark those changes are on this border whenever you go, like if you're familiar with the border here in the US, like you can see those cultures influence each other for far greater distances on either side. Oh, boy. When I was, as the author yourself with Dr. Humphrey, I was captivated by your acknowledgement of how challenging this work is as the writer. And in the introduction, you both write that the border where people are embedded as dissimilar social systems on either side and mostly cannot speak each other's language is where conflicting versions of history and attitudes to the future become starkly visible. And I found that quote to be so fascinating because of telling those two different versions of the story for you as the authors must have been incredibly challenging. And I'm wondering how you seek to tell those stories when the versions are starkly different. How do you go about that as the author?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say that's really the challenge of anthropology as a discipline. Trying to learn to listen to people's story and trying to understand it from their perspective. So it doesn't mean you'll necessarily have to remain uncritical. If there's some issues with the way things are presented, of course you could also talk to people openly. But it's your task to keep an open mind. I would say that although the histories are different. I mean, it's not that the histories are completely different. It's just that some parts are emphasized. The Chinese side will tell you about the Chinese presence in the Russian Far East, and that's something that's kind of been silenced, or that's definitely not made very explicit on the Russian side. When you ask people, they'll tell you, well, there were Manchu, and there were people who are now minorities in China, so therefore it's China. There was a Chinese presence, but it was not a Han Chinese presence. They said there were a presence of Asian populations are now within the Chinese nation, and therefore, China might say it's a Chinese presence, but they would try to counter it in that way. But there were a lot of during the 60s in particular, a lot of names of towns were changed on the Russian side. There was a lot of Chinese names that were turned into Russian names. So these are not the things that you're told when you go to see a Russian museum, for instance. So these histories are kind of different. But to be honest, it was not. I didn't find it particularly challenging in the sense that on both sides there's a lot of goodwill. Mm-hmm. People know that they had a checkered history, that they were very difficult decades, but they recognize that they have to live with each other. So they're trying not to make that. They're not making it too. They're not very forceful about it, I would say. And that was quite different from my previous research, and it was a welcome change actually, because my earlier work in Mongolia, because the very focus of my research was to look at the anti-Chinese sentiment. So there was, I heard a lot of very pretty xenophobic and racist speech, and it was kind of difficult to deal with. And the anthropologists who work with fringe racist groups, right-wing groups, they have to deal with that. And that's really, I think for me it's not something I could do. I find it very, very difficult, very challenging to try and keep a step back and try to of course never be never apologizing, never excusing anything, but try to understand even perspective of people. I would find it very challenging. This was not really the case. It was very dramatically different between the two sides, but not in an aggressive way.
Interesting. Well, and I got the impression from the text that Russia is extremely interested in working with China, mm-hmm. as long as it doesn't involve Chinese people coming into Russia. Like I got that feel while I was reading it, and I'm wondering if I had that right, and if there is like any xenophobia or racism underlying the relationships between these two countries, or if I'm completely off base here.
I think there is, to an extent, that maybe the two sides do not know each other well enough yet. There are more and more Russians learning Chinese.
Oh, cool.
It's the second most popular language in many cities in the Far East after English. And there are more and more young Russians who think, well, China is maybe a good place to go and do some work, to work later, because there's not a lot of opportunities in the Russian Far East. Although I would say that very often they see Chinese language as a bridge to going abroad, rather than a way of embracing Chinese culture. I think the way, when I interviewed a lot of students who learn Chinese, they would say, well, if we speak Chinese, we can go to, southern China. It's a very international. They were really kind of stressing the fact that it was international, that there were a lot of Europeans there, a lot of Americans, a lot of Africans, or people from all over the world. So it was more a way to access these international environments rather than really learning Chinese because of a particular passion for Chinese culture, for instance. I didn't find that China had a very strong soft power in Russia, particularly. It was more kind of a useful language to learn, something that would open doors for you. On the Chinese side, I mean, if also when you find at the border, is also you have to remember these are two still provincial towns, right? So I noticed very often the way that the Russians would talk to the Chinese in Hehe would be very different from the way they would talk to Chinese elsewhere in China, maybe from in Beijing or Shanghai. They were sometimes very dismissive. They would use the informal ways of addressing them. Using in Russian there's two different you, like in French, and they would use the informal you to speak to people in stores and traders, and that's something they would never do if they went to to Europe or America or even other parts of China. So there was some Bruce, kind of not a bit rough on the edges, and Chinese have responded to that. Very often I would get not very nice treatment when I would go into a store, and then they would ask me about Russia and say, "Oh, I'm not Russian," and then suddenly the attitude would change. So it's not that Russians are unpleasant. It's just culturally they're quite different. They can be more abrupt, and it's something that Chinese have kind of learned to recognize. And also when Chinese trade with Russian, they also tend to adopt the same kind of attitudes now. They tend to be less willing to bargain, and they're more abrupt as well. So there's an element of misunderstanding, I would say, more than xenophobia. I was afraid of that, actually, going into, as I mentioned before, after having done research in Mongolia, I was a bit worried of having the same racist speech kind of right there, in having to deal with that. But I saw one anti-Chinese graffiti, and it had been crossed out by somebody else. Only one.
Oh, okay.
So I say you don't really see that. It's more people recognize that they're different. We have to deal with them. So it's more a pragmatic approach.
Okay.
Rather than either hatred or dislike, or it's not that. It's not the kind of fully embrace either. So sort of, yeah.
I see. Okay. I'm glad to be proven wrong there. That's a lot more of a positive, but interpretation.
But if I must say that ideas of China might be different elsewhere in Russia.
Mm.
The fear that that China is taking over the Russian Far East is more something you would hear in Western Russia, where they don't know, they just assume. Whereas on the borders, they know that's not the case. So there's much less of that. So there's a scholar from the Russian Far East, a Russian scholar, a friend, told us once, if you're in Moscow, they assume the way they describe the Russian Far East, they think there's just Chinese and bears. There's no one, it's just Chinese. So they have no idea, basically, something they don't know, and they would not. You tell them the name Blagoveshchensk, the other people would not have a clue where it is, even though it's one of the three most important towns on the border. They never heard of it. So it's so different. It's a different way you are.
Excellent. Well, I mean, we're living through a really important moment in history with the recent Russian invasion of China. Yes. And, I want to talk a little bit about trade as well. You've brought it up a couple of times, and I want to hone in on that and nail it down a little more purposefully here. But, from reading the text, I kind of got the impression that Russia needs China a little bit more than China needs Russia with regards to trade matters. And yet Russia wants to, emanate an image of strength. And I'm curious about the power differential with regards to trade and influence that, motivates each side. And, if there's any change in that relationship that you're noticing with regards to the recent military invasions that are roiling the world at the moment.
Right. So I think what I can say about that particular border would probably have some relevance to the what's happening with Ukraine. Russia really still sees itself as a world power. I mean, it sees itself as, it is in some way, but it sees itself as much more of a world power than it actually is. And with China, Russians have not really been prepared to treat Chinese as full equals. There's still this general perception that China is poorer, and of course that's changing for Russians who have traveled further south and to larger cities, but there's still this idea that China is not quite developed yet. And even looking at people in Blagoveshchensk, looking at Kherson on the other side, which is brighter and skyscrapers, they will just describe it as fake. They think, it's not real. It's just a front. If you just go a little bit beyond the riverfront, there's nothing there. You have really bad housing, and it's true to an extent that the nicest architecture is right there on the border, right there on the river, because it's prime real estate. But there's this idea that Russia is still kind of the elder brother leading the way, and has been very challenging for Russians to accept that this might no longer be the truth, that China is actually ahead of them in many ways. So I think that also speaks to what's happening with Ukraine. There's the sense that Russia wants to protect itself, so wants to demonstrate its strength, and there's also the sense for Ukraine that it's not really. It's still part of Russia in some way, and that's something I discuss in my current the book I'm finishing. This idea of phantom territories. That territories that you recognize are no longer yours, but somehow they still elicit this kind of affective power that is somehow it's no longer Russia, but it's still somehow not foreign either.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an interesting. So they use the idea of backyard, the idea of the kind of the backyard. I think it's a really good image. The sense that it's still part of your possession. The backyard in your house. It's not the house itself, but it's still within your realm. So and you see that as well with the Russia-China border. There's some cities in China, like Harbin, for instance, they're still seen as Russian because they were established by Russia. It was established by Russia. There's still this kind of Russian flavor, and people in Russia will say, "Oh, when we go to Harbin, we feel at home. It's like it feels like it's our town." And there's also the recognition that a lot of the Russian Far East, is subject to similar phantom sentiments on the part of the Chinese.
Gotcha. And something else, you touch on other spots too that are related to aggression and assimilation. I was intrigued to see the Uyghur assimilation and re-education efforts mentioned in the book, the attempted assimilation of Hong Kong, the suppression of Tibet. This sort of reminds me of what has, been happening in Crimea as well, and is now happening with the surrounding of an invasion of Russia, of Ukraine by Russia. And I'm wondering how it feels for you as an anthropologist that you cover countries that have aggressive tactics of suppression being a part of their regular existence. How does this sit with you as a person who, goes these places frequently and has to incorporate this kind of stuff into your work?
So that's this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot, and is doing research in countries like Russia and China is with authoritarian regimes and with assimilation and suppression of minorities, and sometimes in very violent ways, is very challenging, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, because on the one hand, you wonder whether you should continue. You should actually go and spend time in these places, because if you go there, you have to be very careful what you say, and your silence can be seen as collusion. So what do you do? Do you continue doing research in China and then say nothing when the subject comes up? Or in Russia, Russia now is out of bounds for everyone working there, but generally, it's up to 2 weeks ago. Do you go there? But if you do not go there, then are you abandoning people? You have responsibilities as well. So if you do not go, are you leaving the Uyghurs, without a voice? But then if you go, can you actually convey whether, first, do you have access to them? Do you have access to these populations in a way that does not endanger them? And it's really difficult. I think it's a personal choice. I think that's, for me, I've decided not to do research in either Russia or China now, for the moment. But it's a very difficult decision. I'm working on a collection with two colleagues of mine on the idea of redaction, on the idea of what is it like to do research in places like Russia, China, North Korea. One of my two colleagues works on Tibet, and the other one on North Korea. How do you do research there? Can you do that? How do you write about it in a way that does not endanger yourself, but especially your interlocutors? And we feel, as we work on this project, we feel it's becoming increasingly relevant, not only because we want to challenge this dichotomous division between authoritarian on one side and non-authoritarian on the other side, because things are changing very quickly. The situation in Europe, the situation in the United States is becoming different. It's in the United States, it's exhibiting worrying signs of things that you cannot say. If you work on the border with Mexico, for instance, people have been arrested because they've left water for migrants. They've they've tried to, in Europe as well, people have been arrested because they try to rescue people from boats. So you also have so what we've learned working in these difficult contexts is becoming important toolkits for people working anywhere, really.
Yeah. Well, this book has been a real important text for me because it's got me thinking about borderlands much more broadly around the world and has exposed me to a massive blind spot that I'm kind of shocked that I never really considered. So I'm very grateful to you for your work and for this book. And, I'm wondering if you could just tell people if they want to follow your work or anything like that, what they should check out or anything like that. Do you have anything that you'd like to point people to?
I have a website where I try to centralize kind of the various pieces of work the various projects I've been working on. So either books that have been published or books are in progress or new projects I'm kind of thinking about. So they can just check the website, which is my name, frankbillé.com. I have also a presence on Twitter, but barely. So I would say the website is probably the best way to then I'm very happy for people to get in touch with me by email and ask questions or discuss things, so yeah, people should feel free to do that. I'll be very glad to hear that, especially with the pandemic, with no conferences and everything. You feel sometimes that you publish something and it falls into some kind of abyss.
Yes.
And you don't know whether people read it. You have no idea. People don't talk to you about it. So it's good to, I'm very happy to get feedback, positive or negative, or suggestions, or definitely.
Excellent.
That's probably the best way. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Franck Billé, I have loved this conversation and the book On the Edge, Life Along the Russia-China Border, which you co-authored with Dr. Caroline Humphrey and is out now from Harvard Press. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a real thrill.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I was very, very glad to talk to you about this. Thank you.